Also, you'll see that the Saskatchewan government is signaling very clearly that it doesn't plan to establish additional protected areas in northwest Saskatchewan before it allows oil sands development to take place. This became very clear last month when the province leased out land for oil sands development that specifically has lands on it that the Parks branch of the Saskatchewan government and a number of environmental organizations, including the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, had identified as prime candidates for protected areas. And the provincial government included those prime land areas in oil sands leases that were for sale. So a protected area strategy for the Northwest is going to be jeopardized by oil sands development. Well, those are some of just a few examples of some of the impacts that are associated with oil sands. I want to touch on a couple of the important sort of political dimensions of this. One is that personally, my view is that we shouldn't get into oil sands at all in Saskatchewan. Many people argue that maybe we can do it if we don't do it Alberta style, and that we can regulate it. You know, we can have really tough regulations for acid rain. We can do a lot of water recycling. We can have dry tailings instead of wet tailings. Whether these mitigation measures would really be effective, I'm not sure. Certainly we could make it better than it's been in Alberta. But in order to make it better, you have to have a will to regulate. And so I invite you to ask yourself whether that will to regulate exists in Canada and in Saskatchewan. And I would argue that it doesn't. And here's how you can make that argument if you want to. First of all, think about what is happening right now along the Athabaskan River. This is a blatant violation of the Fisheries Act. You know, I mean, it is illegal to allow toxic substances into a river. Who's enforcing the Fisheries Act? The federal government certainly isn't. They're turning a blind eye. And Alberta Environment are doing no better. So large amounts of toxic material are gradually leaking into the Athabaskan River and into the groundwater with no regulation under the Fisheries Act. And then I'd invite you to think about the Saskatchewan scene. One of the things that my government that I was a part of did, the NDP government, when it was in, is it did quite a good job of establishing protected areas. And 9% of the province is actually in protected areas right now as a result of the work that was done in the 1990s. But I didn't notice that Saskatchewan Environment during the years that I was in government did a particularly good job of regulating against pollution. We didn't have transboundary regulations for acid rain under the government that I was part of either, despite the fact that some of us would have liked to see that. So and this is a partisan comment, and you'll have to judge it for what it is. But now I think we have a premier that is even less interested in regulating. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. When the federal government said, you know, we'd like to have new regulations for greenhouse gas emissions effective all oil sands plants that start in 2012, Premier Wall said, not here in Saskatchewan, you're not going to have these regulations. We want an exemption from them. And if you look at a March 18th speech that the Premier gave in New York, you'll see the citations for that. I'm happy to give anybody the references that think that would be useful. More recently this fall, when Prime Minister Harper again said, you know, we're not going to sell this bitumen to countries that have a worse greenhouse gas emission record than Canada. Premier Wall said, no, you're not. Not with Saskatchewan oil sands, you're not. We're gonna fight the federal government on that issue. Now, those are sending very, very clear signals to the oil sands industry that they don't need to worry about being regulated in a significant way in this province. And in a 4-hour meeting that I recently had with Environment Department officials and Oil Sands Quest, when we were done, if you'd asked me who I'd rather have regulating the industry, the department or Oil Sands Quest, I'd have chosen Oil Sands Quest. When you ask, do you have any more plans for protected areas, Saskatchewan Environment says, no, we don't. Oil Sands Quest said, you know, we've spent $4 million doing an environmental impact study of the area that we're wanting to do oil sands development in. We have identified sensitive areas, and we're prepared not to go into them, even though the provincial government isn't requiring us to do that. We're prepared to leave them. So it's really interesting to see the difference. Oil Sands Quest is, I think, what you'll see as the best of the oil sands industry. Bear in mind that this is a little company and that it is almost certain to sell to a big oil company. It won't be the big player in the oil sands industry in this province, but it is, I guess, a friendly first run at oil sands in Saskatchewan. Don't for a minute think that the kind of better citizenship you see from Oil Sands Quest is likely to be seen from any of the big players. And it will ultimately have to sell its interest to those larger players. It doesn't have the capital to do this on its own. So Suncor and the like will move into Saskatchewan. You can be almost certain of that. Two other dimensions to the political arena that I want to touch on in closing. One is that with oil sands in Saskatchewan, if we allow it, will come an increased risk of a nuclear power plant in this province, with all the difficulties that are associated with that in terms of high-level radioactive waste disposal, tritium leaking into water supplies, the risk, obviously, of a catastrophic radiation accident, which is a low risk, but is a risk that we have to take account of. This would be the first place in the world where we'd actually see nuclear power, if we get it, being used to accelerate fossil fuel development instead of to replace it. It would really be quite shocking. Personally, I don't want to see a reactor in this province. I'd much rather see us focus our efforts on developing renewable sources of energy in Saskatchewan. We are blessed with remarkable solar resources. We have the best wind regime in all of North America. If the Germans can develop 21,000 megawatts of wind power in an area the size of southern Saskatchewan, we can certainly do the same. And our total electricity use in this province is only about 3,000 megawatts. And all that really prevents us from becoming a wind power province right now is our inability right now to integrate intermittent sources of electricity onto the grid in amounts greater than 20%. But the Danes and the Spanish have shown that you can produce 20% of all your electricity from wind, and you can integrate it into the grid very nicely. And right now we produce 2.5% of our electricity from wind. So we could have an 8-fold increase in wind power in this province and integrate it into the grid in a very effective way. And that's just one example of the potential for renewables in this province. We're blessed with a forest the size of Germany. We're not utilizing it to meet our energy needs at all right now. Let me just close by giving you the example of Denmark and Sweden that have greenhouse gas footprints that are 1/7 or less than ours on a per capita basis. And you'll see communities in those two countries that have developed renewables in a very significant way. The Danes, for instance, would never allow the Queen Elizabeth power plant to release all its waste heat into the river. They'd be capturing that heat, and they'd be using it to heat the entire downtown of Saskatoon. And that's what they do as a matter of standard practice in cities like Stockholm and Copenhagen. District heating is just thought to be routine. And with district heating, where you can use waste heat sources, but you can also use hot water sources as a way of heating your buildings.